Be perfect.
And you can tell that we're talking as we're hitting our own button to start our own show, because that's how we roll around here at Unscripted with Ally and Jen. Jen, hi. How are you? Who are you? What the hell do you do in the world? And what are we here to talk about today?
Great question on all of the questions. So I'm Jen. I am a hybrid book publisher focusing on elevating thought leaders, most of the time who are coming from underrepresented communities or underrepresented voices. And we have a strong focus on strategy and collaborating between our authors. And so today's conversation is talking about successful creative collaborations between authors and publishing professionals, which I know, Ally, stems from some recent situation that occurred on your side. So we can't wait to get into that, but obviously share a little bit more about who you are and what you do, and then we can get into I think this is going to be a juicy conversation, personally.
It is, and it's going to be fast and furious because we both have calls that we have to jump to way earlier than we normally wrap up this show. So we're going to be hot, folks. A game of hot potato with lots of really great content and information. And please let us know if you are here live by dropping some love and comments into the chat. So I'm Ally with The Right Place, Right Time. I am a book coach and ghostwriter with some developmental editing focus. And I'm also here about helping the voiceless, the marginalized, the overlooked, the invisible get their words onto the page. Nonfiction only, but within that space, memoir is my favorite. And honestly, sneak peek, probably the only thing I'm doing in 2025. So for anybody who is watching or listening and interested in working with me in the nonfiction space, you either need to have a chat with me now about your prescriptive nonfiction, or you're going to not work with me next year because I'm just doing memoir. There, I said it. It's now out there in the universe, and so I have to stick to it.
You do. Flag has been planted in the sand.
Done. I have said it, and it is now out there, and so it is. Now, today's topic. I love this topic so much so because I truly believe, like truly and deeply believe, that authors and their publishing professionals, whoever that is, at whatever stage on the journey, whether it's your coach, your editor, your publisher, I don't care, your cover designer, it is a partnership. It is a collaboration. And there are things that I think make this successful. And I think that there are things that make this lousy. And I think it begins from initial conversations and happens all the way through the duration of the collaboration being present. So like, or I guess the better way to say that is throughout the engagement, from day one to day whatever, it needs to be in step with your people. So,
yep.
Jen, talk on that.
Well, Mary Catherine Jones says, hey, and she's looking forward to this. So I'm glad that, and if you have questions specifically that are on your mind, please, pop them into the chat. But yeah, Ally, I can't wait to hear what prompted this, because I feel like I have conversations every day of the week, every week of the year, that are somehow connected to a lack of communication, a lack of expectation, someone thinking that it was going to be more collaborative than it actually is designed to be. And so I'm, as you know, from a publishing standpoint, for specifically anyway, I'm constantly advocating on behalf of authors as a publisher, which is not necessarily the norm in this industry. There's a lot of shady characters that we've absolutely discussed in past episodes. So please certainly go back to our kind of backlist of things we've talked about. But I do think that it has to be a collaboration. And we were intentional about these successful creative collaborations with the wording here too. So Ally, do you want to kind of dive into what prompted your you're like, yes, let's talk about this?
Yes, I do. And maybe it was just because Mercury was in retrograde, it seemed like, for 2 months or something. But it seemed that I kept getting hit by clients who were coming to me with frustrations about who they were working with as a publisher. And I thought, okay, what's in the water? What is happening right now? And all of these publishers, I'm not going to name names, but all the publishers, reputable, credible, like wonderful people, have systems in place and stuff like that. And then all of the authors, all wonderful people, you know, who are doing all the right things, thinking about all the right things. And so I thought, what the heck is going on? Like, you know, by just looking at profiles alone, like I was not envisioning that there would be some distress, you know, between them. And it was the authors complaining more than the publishers complaining about the authors. But I thought every relationship is a two-way street, right? And it got me thinking about, okay, what does a successful and creative collaboration look like? And what is happening in all of these instances where people are coming to me asking me to help them troubleshoot what they should do in the instance of X, Y, or Z, right? So I was hearing things like about, you know, too many checklists that overwhelm, and then the author doesn't really know what they're supposed to be doing, and they feel like they don't have a handle on the situation because there's lots of resources, but they're not having enough face time. Examples of like systemizing certain processes and then losing a personal touch when it came to email communications or that kind of thing. Others feeling like response times were really slacking and like didn't know where things were because they hadn't heard back, even though they had asked the question, right? And been proactive in asking the question. And it's like, if I step back and I think about all of those things, I can argue that systems are good. That's true. Resources are wonderful to have to refer back to. Also true. Trying to automate something so it goes a little bit more efficiently can also be beneficial. You know, not everybody has to respond within 24 hours. So there does have to be some patience on the part of the author. But at the end of the day, I think what it comes down to, and this is not, even though my scenarios, let me say this, even though my scenarios are between publisher and author, what I'm about to say next, I think pertains to an author working with any publishing professional. And that is, how has the expectations around each party's responsibility been detailed and outlined at the outset? But more than that, how do you know about how the other person likes to communicate, learn, and tackle a project, right? Like, because not everybody does well with a resource bank. Not everybody does well with a checklist. Not everybody does well, you know, with an automated message that everybody gets, even though they might understand that it's systemized. So it's like, how well do we know each other's process? How well do we know each other's learning style, communication style? Have those things been outlined at the beginning, so that we avoid pain and agony and discomfort later on? And then, of course, once you hit that moment of frustration, then figuring out, how do I confront the issue? And are they going to think that I'm being a jerk? And, you know, so that's what's prompted today's conversation.
You have just said so much.
I know. I said, I'm excited about this conversation. I want to help everyone.
I do too, because I agree with you that all the things that you just mentioned are good things to have, but you are spot on with that. Not everyone does well with some way that your process might be set up. So whether it is a publisher or a cover designer or an editor, there has to be clear expectations. And you know what? One of the things that we do at the start of our process, and it's honestly, all the things that you mentioned, I'm like, we've had a problem with that before. We've had someone say that before, because we're not perfect, right? Like, I strive and my team strives for excellence every day, but we don't always meet it because of one thing or another. And so, you know, we recently had an author who was just having, just wasn't feeling like they were frustrated. And that's actually the first word that you said was frustrated. They were frustrated. And it was because it was a communication breakdown. And so I jumped in and I'm like, all right, let's get on a call. Let's talk about it. Let's recalibrate. Let's level set, figure out where the breakdown is occurring. And so I was able, I also think, I wish it weren't a superpower, but I think it is a superpower of mine, of being able to jump into really difficult conversations when someone is upset, to be able to like, just kind of like smooth the air, really listen and hear what the grievance is, honor that, because even if I disagree with it, in this case, I wasn't, but even if I did disagree with it, I still need to honor where that person's coming from and how they're feeling about the situation. I think most of the time, what I've noticed is that people just want to feel heard. So when we're thinking about the process of like how to, as an author, make sure your voice is being heard, is I think just saying it, sending that email framed in whatever delicate way or whatever the communication method is, and say, I'm feeling really frustrated with the process. The processes for the following reasons, because most people, especially because I know the people that you would refer business to. So whoever's having situations, they're good publishing professionals, right? Like, you're not sending people out into the wild, of which the there are so many bad ones. I know you're not sending people to bad ones.
Right.
And I know I'm not one of the bad ones. And yet I've still encountered situations that would fall into this too. So I would say for the author to be able to just be honest, to say, I'm not feeling heard. I'm not feeling whatever the thing is. Can we have a call and just kind of figure out how we might be able to change things? Because I feel like the good hybrids, I will speak on behalf of hybrids, the good publishing professionals are not going to be so rigid that they're like, no, you either do it our way or there's no way, right? There's going to be that collaboration there. So I think a lot of times an author is coming to authorship feeling disempowered, not because of the publishing professionals, not because of who they're working with, but because of how the hierarchy of this industry operates, where it's almost like the author has to be grateful that they have an opportunity to work with someone to get their book published, because of just kind of the standards that the traditional side of the industry has kind of set forth. So I think sometimes people are coming into this, even if they don't consciously know that they're feeling disempowered, they're already kind of feeling disempowered, even if they have all of the systems around them to empower them. So I think just having an open dialogue, to me, is kind of that first step in what does a collaboration really look like? Because it is the setting the expectations. But when something's not being met, just being, and being respectful about it. Okay, obviously both sides have to be respectful about it. But to me, that seems to be like something that could alleviate a significant amount of the stress for everybody involved.
Yeah. But I also think then that if communication is key, you need to know what those channels are and which ones are appropriate to take, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think putting something in an email is good. It's better than saying nothing. Yet at the same time, so many things can get lost in translation if egos come into play, right? So I think part of it is everybody's got to do their ego check. And again, everybody's got an ego. So this is not saying that publishers that I'm referring to these examples are egotistical or my authors are egotistical, but just that by saying I don't like the way a process is going doesn't mean that they don't like you or that it's personal, right? So checking your ego on that side, but also for the author and how they might respond. If a system is a system and they have it in place, don't automatically assume that they're going to correct the process specifically to you when there's a reason that they've created this process or system in the first place. But, I would say at the outset, going back to something that I said about how this begins at the very first, conversation and lasts throughout the engagement, is outlining who is responsible for what. And if there is a problem or challenge, how would you together as collaborators prefer to work through the issue, right? Part of the reason I think I've been troubleshooting what should the author do, and of course my advice is always the same, say it out loud, is because nobody talks about what happens if there's a challenge, right? We are really good at talking about our process, how we're going to take them through step A through whatever based on our part in the journey. But I don't know that we always address, and if you have a challenge or if you have a problem, then this is how I would like to see us resolve it. Or these are the things we have in place to take that feedback and make it better and make it different. And I think there's also from an expectation standpoint, right? You mentioned, Jen, authors coming in maybe disempowered because of how the industry runs. But at the same time, I think that it's possible that an author comes in with an expectation that service is going to be at a certain level when they're paying for publishing, right? So when they're in a pay to play model and they're throwing thousands of dollars at their book, they want to feel like they are the only person under the sun that matters, when the reality is they're not the only author going through the process with the publisher, which is why there are processes in place, right? That's why there's systems and checklists and resources. So I think the other thing that needs to be addressed at the outset is like, how will I feel as a client going through your process? How many other people are you working with? I just got asked this question actually right before this call. I was having a conversation with a prospect and they said to me, how many other projects are you working on? And how does that impact your attention to my project.
Brilliant
right?
question. Brilliant.
I was like, thank you. Yes, let's talk about that. Who am I working with and how does that look? And I thought, yeah, that's a great question for both people to know the answer to, including the provider. Like, yeah, what are you going to do to ensure that that person feels like they're getting your full attention, right? While you also trying to continue to hold boundaries around your time and make sure that you're not shortchanging anybody else and nobody's getting, preferential treatment, or whatever it is. So folks who are joining us live, we've already dropped some sweet beats. All right. But things to talk about in those opening conversations. How do you troubleshoot issues? How many other clients are you working with at a time? And what does that mean for your attention to them? What should they expect from you as a client? They're paying for a service, yes, but how does that translate in terms of actual communication and attentiveness? And then also, I think the other thing that needs to be flat out made clear is who are they going to be working with? This is the other thing that's come up. Well, I had my initial meeting with so-and-so from the publishing company, but then I got handed off to this other person that I didn't know I was going to get handed off to, and I don't understand their role. And the reason I went with the publisher was because I really liked this person who I connected with, but now I don't have any access to that person. So again, understanding who else in that business are they going to face off with, right? What is their role? And then how does that relationship work? Because now we've got new people in place, right? Collaboration doesn't always necessarily mean one-to-one.
Yeah. I recently had to do some reshuffling of folks on our side, kind of dividing up the workload of one of our project managers to a few of the others. And I know how I have felt when I have engaged with a service provider, because at the end of the day, even though we are a publisher, we are still a service provider. I hate that is what we're kind of boil it down to relegate it to. We're both service providers at the absolute end of the day. Even though we both know we're giving way more, we are much more collaborative. We are there. We are partners. We are thought partners. And looking at having to move things around, I didn't want anyone to feel like, oh, she's just dumping me on this new person. So I jumped in and I'm like, all right, let's get on a call. I'm going to introduce you to your new project manager, your new primary person, and we'll just make sure that everyone's on the same page. And it doesn't take that much time or effort. And I was able to ease that transition for someone, because I know how it's felt on the other side when I've worked on a big project. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait a minute. I've been communicating with this person for 3 months and all of a sudden they're gone. And then there's no there's no, nobody coming in being like, oh, by the way, you have this new person. All of a sudden just somebody responds from their email. It just doesn't feel good. Mary's saying, I was just suggested to a handoff with a company I was working with. No advanced communication. Yeah. It stinks. And at the same time, there's the side of everyone has their side to the story too. So it'd be curious, what caused the handoff, and what could they have done better? As what would you have liked to have happen? As Ally just dropped in the chat, I think it's just complicated. But at the same time, I think if we are holding each other with respect, both parties, all parties are holding each other with respect and open communication. I think, to me, that's where everything can kind of be resolved. Because if someone comes in, they're like, you have no right to decide, just because you like that person, I can just come in and be the puppet master and move you from that person anytime. Who wants to? No one wants to be in a militant environment like that. It's not good for creativity, which this whole process has to be creative. It's inherently creative. So, it's just these basic things that I feel like somehow get missed, or, you're kind of stewing on something because you're like, oh, that person didn't do how I would have done it. And then it happens again, and it starts to erode your trust in the process. Instead of getting to that place of erosion, just be honest. Because I think most people would prefer just the direct honesty to say, hey, I don't really like how this is happening. Is there something we can do to counter it? And like you said before, maybe it's not rechanging a whole system or a policy or process, but there's still there's the human element here. We're just telling people stories for a living, for crying out loud. Like, there has to be a human element.
There does. Okay, so that's a perfect segue. I think at the end of the day, the answer really to any challenge is to think about how the person on the other side wants to be treated. Is like to get down to like, what is this actually about? Is it actually about a system being overwhelming, or is it about how the human processes information, or the way that this person's schedule looks, and their capacity, right? Like digging deeper, going beyond like the symptom to like get down to, what they're about and how they show up and what makes them tick. And I know that we're not all in the business of psychology and social work and emotional intelligence and things like that, but you kind of have to get down to that level so that they feel seen and heard from the very beginning. And, one of my biggest issues, and I'm asked this a lot, like, what makes you stand out from like other people who do this thing, right? And my answer is always like, well, I give a shit and I am a human at the end of the day, like, and I care about my people as they are humans. Yes, systems are nice, processes are nice, but so are personalized touches that make the other person feel like they're not just in an engine and going through your emotions. And you can make somebody feel that whether you're an individual provider or you have a team of people, right? So if you have a team of people, then I think it's really making sure that the team of people understand the values that you want, or the culture that you want the client to experience. If you're an individual, you need to be asking yourself, how do you make them feel seen, heard, and valued throughout the process, from the very first interaction. I think where some of these more recent examples have gotten it wrong have been relying too heavily on systems and processes, and then therefore missing out on the human connection and human touch. And to go back to your point too, Jen, with like, the team, and you don't want anybody to feel like you've done a bait and switch, like, they met you, but then they get a bunch of other people. My biggest recommendation, because I've seen this happen in one of these more recent examples, is making sure that you identify for your author that once they start the process with you, this is the number of handoffs within the team that they're going to experience, who they're going to be hearing from at what point. More recently, it was like we started a conversation with one person, all of a sudden we were tapped by another person. Then that shifted to this other person, and it was intentional on the publisher's, standpoint. Like, okay, when the manuscript moves from one part to another part, there's going to be a new person who's going to like take the baton. But we didn't know that. Like, so we got in there, the engine is clearly working, and we're just being churned out into the next phase to the next person. All these people are perfectly wonderful people, and they all have a role, and they all probably do it really well. But on the user side, it was like, we have no idea what's happening. We don't know who we're supposed to go to. We don't understand all the different roles of these people because we haven't been given that information. And so it was clunky, and it got us off on the wrong foot. Yeah. Right. And so now there's just kind of like, we're probably coming across like we're whiny. They're coming across like, they don't care about how they're communicating. Neither of that is true on either end. Yeah. Right. But that's how it feels. And then you've got that like angst, and you're like, oh, is this the way that the rest of the process is going to be like? Right. And so it just breeds this negative energy that you can carry with you, all the way through if you don't like handle that like right off at the beginning.
Yeah. One of the things that we've done, and I would hope other people do it too, but we have like obviously like a form that is completed at the start of the process. And we ask for a ton of information. And I warn people in advance. I'm like, listen, when we get going, before we get on our kickoff call, we're going to ask you for a lot of stuff. Do what you can. Don't be overwhelmed. Do what you can. But one of the things that we ask is, when are you taking vacations? What holidays are you observing? When can we just know that you are generally going to be unavailable? Because if we have a timeline created and did not factor in the fact that the author is in their RV for a month and not working, then that's going to cause friction and chaos. So that's like one just little thing that helps a lot. And the other is, what type of communicator are you? How do you want to be communicated with? Do you want standing calls? Do you want them to be calls? Do you want them to be video calls? Would you prefer just to be on email only? Like, what is your actual preference? And are you a more detail-oriented person, or are you a more high-level person? Because depending on how someone wants their information to be delivered, like you and I were currently about to birth a book baby collectively between an author that we're both working with. And this person is a really detailed person. So if we were to have our system in place that only provided super high level, they would be like, well, I don't fully understand what's going on. And at the same time, if you have someone who's like, I just want, like, for me, it kind of depends, but most of the time I'm like, just tell me what I need to know and what you need from me. Like that is my style when I'm working with other providers. So me getting all the details, I'm never going to read them. I'm never going to look at them. I just want you to tell me what you need from me. And so giving me all of the overwhelming details wouldn't work for me either. And it's not to say either of those styles are right or wrong. They're not, because it's just a different style. So I feel like us getting to the bottom of that at the front part of the conversation in the beginning of it alleviates a lot of what you were just kind of talking about. But I also think, like, if your process is, because I can kind of see the benefit of why there would just be a handoff from phase to phase, because there's someone who's an expert in that phase. In our case, we have a project manager or a team of them who are ushering from start to finish. So you always have at least one of the same person the whole time. But I can see how that other way would work too. But if that's not what's been communicated at the start, then you're going to have the situation you're in where there's just kind of confusion and frustration because you're like, what the hell? Whereas at least if they had said, this is our process, you were going to hear from 5 different people from start to finish, you'd be like, oh, all right, I expect that. And then you know that when you're with this person, okay, the next step starts when I get handed off to the next person, rather than just being confused.
Well, and I think in this particular instance, they're growing and they're shifting and they're changing systems and they're trying to make it more efficient. And I think that that is definitely something that's reasonable for all of us as we grow our businesses and things start to change. We have to change, right? As we get more clients, we have to change to manage it all. I think if it had been communicated at the outset that they were in the midst of changing things, and so therefore things might be a little bit clunky, we would have had a little more grace to begin with because we understood what was happening behind the scenes. Now, they might not have been anticipating, issues, so they didn't feel like they needed to say anything, right? So you have to kind of give both sides the benefit of the doubt. I think one additional question, I love the questions that you're asking, Jen. I think an additional question that people should really be asking is, in addition to the high level or detail orientation or how do you like to learn, is to be very specific. Would you like your information provided visually or like by video audio, right? Like some people just, they want the video of you talking and explaining the next step, short, sweet. They can click on a button, they can listen in the car, whatever it is, they know what they need to do next. Other people want it all written out so they can refer back to it later. But like, if you are not a reader or visual learner, and you're also not detail oriented, sending the long email with the 15 paragraphs of dense information about what's happening next and why it's important, right, is going to just be like, let's close it down and let's move on. Like, I will deal with that later. And what we run the risk of is then not meeting milestones, not hitting the timeline that's in place, because there's a dysfunction in the way that people are offering and receiving, right, information. The communication piece is huge. Now, I think that there's a lot to be said for how people can communicate from that initial conversation, right? Like, so, and this is on both parties. Both parties should be vetting each other. Both parties should be interviewing one another. Neither party should just be saying yes to the other because it's the first person that they spoke with, or, they hit the right price point, whether you're paying or you're receiving, right? It's about values. It's about energetic alignment. It's about, whether or not you each see something in the book that you're working on together. Obviously, the author should see the merit and the worth in their book, but you want your provider to be right there with you, right? And passionate about the process. But like, how are they communicating with you in that call? Because their communication and how they're showing up, whether that's verbal or nonverbal, is going to say a lot to you about how they are as a provider. Also true of the client, how they're showing up to the call, right? Verbal or nonverbal is going to tell you a lot about how they're going to show up as a collaborator. If they steal the show and they talk at you and this just happened to me recently too. Somebody found out what I did. They were really curious. They started to tell me all about the thing that they were working on. And then they talked at me for the next 60 minutes. I was like, oh dear, like, I don't know that this is the right fit. Like, if this person wanted to truly pay me for my services, because I wouldn't be able to show up as a coach if I have no space to actually say anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Point.
Now that might just be the way that they show up. So like nothing wrong with how they show up, but that might not make me the ideal partner for them. Right. And in that instance might be more on me to say no. Right. Somebody can be for you, but that doesn't mean that they are for you.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. You and the slogans today. That's another shirt. This is the third t-shirt you've designed today.
I just get crazy about this.
Okay. I do too, because I don't think enough people are talking about it. And that's why I appreciate both of our very blunt, straightforward approaches, just generally speaking, and why this kind of show even began, is that I don't think enough people are just talking about this in such a matter-of-fact way, and also saying it in a way that empowers the authors. Because I think a lot of times the information that we're looking at or authors are reading is very disempowering. And so for us to even just be blunt, to be like, listen, it is just as much about like your choice versus the publisher's choice. Because I think you had said before, like, you know, just because someone shows interest doesn't mean, just because that's the first conversation doesn't mean it's the right conversation. And, you know, got to think about, what are the publishers or that service provider's superpowers? Like what do they do really well with? For example, I have a really close friend of mine who also has a hybrid publishing company, does a lot of children's books and does, you know, like fiction, a little bit of nonfiction. Talking to her recently, and she was like, I really can't handle your, how does she say it? I can't handle your referrals of people with stories around trauma. Like, I don't want to do memoirs anymore. And I was like, all right, because like there's a lot of times people, I'm not the right fit for them for whatever reason. And so then I, you know, send them her way or another service provider. And she was just saying, she's like, it's just their trauma stories, at least the people that she was recently dealing with, bleed into the process, and it doesn't work well with her processes. Versus you're working on memoirs, a lot of trauma, oftentimes in memoirs. I have a traumatic story myself, written a memoir about it, and we work with a lot of authors that have some kind of trauma, and we have systems built and designed to be able to handle and have that space for someone's emotions. There are plenty of publishers who don't have that space for emotions. So I think it's really self-aware of this friend of mine to say, I don't want these projects because I don't feel like I'm the right fit for them. So it's kind of it's a little bit of, there's obviously like the self-awareness from the author standpoint to be able to say, what is it that I really need? And it's a self-awareness from the publisher to be like, this is something we're really good at, or it's something we're not good at. And if it's not something you're good at, pass it on to someone else who is credible and reputable and can kind of make sure that the person is getting the experience that they're looking for. Because there really is just, that's how things start off really poorly. And we just had this conversation the other day, and I was like, wow, that's really just, I'm grateful that you're telling me this, because now I can find another hybrid who is good at memoirs that might be the ones that aren't a good fit for us. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right? And there's not. And I think, you know, it's great that that particular publishing partner has like drawn the line in the sand. She recognizes that she doesn't want to hold space for that type of genre. Yeah. But I also want to empower authors who are working in memoir, and specifically memoirs that are traumatic, to also ask their service providers if they can hold space. This is also another brilliant question that I got recently on a call with a prospect a couple weeks ago. I already knew the story because she'd given me some details in her contact form as she was scheduling the call. We then proceeded to email back and forth a little bit. So I knew a lot about the story before we actually jumped on and we had a conversation on Zoom. And either in the conversation or in an email that followed after, I can't remember which, you know, she said to me, she said, you know, the one thing that I didn't get around, must have been in an email, the one thing that I didn't get around to asking you was whether or not you felt that you had the emotional capacity to take on such a traumatic story, you know, given what I know about you, because she knew that I was a mom and her trauma took place as a child. And I was like, what a great question. Yeah. Right. Not that she needs to take care of me. She doesn't, but that she was aware enough of her own story and her own narrative to know that what she needed was a provider who was going to be able to be there with her at that emotional level, to hold the container, and to also have their own emotional capacity to do the work, and then also turn it off at the end of the day to go be like a normal, you know, normally functioning human.
Yeah.
So, it's also on authors to be asking really great and wonderful questions. And okay, if you don't know out of the gate what those questions should be, that's why we're having this conversation, is to give you a leg up and think about things that you should ask. But definitely the publishers, service providers, whoever should also be asking themselves when a project comes in, is this the type of project I want to work with or on? Not just about the author. The author could be a great person. You might love their energy and their sense of humor, but the story itself gets to you on any number of levels, and it's just not hitting you where it needs to. There's a way to say no gracefully and to bow out and still be in service to those people without being the chosen person that they engage with, sign a contract for, and walk away. And I think also with memoir people, even if a publishing provider does not say to you whether or not they will or they won't work on something or they have the capacity for it, even if you don't think to ask that question, read the room. Okay. That sounds so awful, but read the room. If you're getting just like a blank stare and they can't even offer like an "I'm so sorry that happened to you," or "Wow, it must be really powerful to write this thing," and they are literally just like a deer in the headlights, might not be the right fit.
Agreed.
Right? Like, might not be the right fit. Like, because if they can't figure out how to respond in that initial conversation, how are you going to be able to naturally talk to them about your book throughout the process of getting it to the next stage, whatever it is that you're working on, cover design, editing, whatever. So read the room. How are they responding? How are they reacting? If they ignore what you say altogether and then jump into, well, how are you going to market that? That might not feel so great.
No.
Like, if they are just ignoring the emotional piece of what you just said and they're jumping right to business, they might not mean to be insulting or offensive or uncaring or anything. They might just be strictly uncomfortable and have no idea what to respond with, but that's still a clue. Like, that's still a sign to be paying attention to.
Yeah. These are such good, like really good observations. And, there's just so much nuance to someone's story. And this is going to be a generalization. So it's, again, buy at your own risk, find the right partner at your own, beware all of the things. But it's oftentimes those service providers that have really inexpensive price points where these experiences are much more prevalent, in my experience anyway, and at least in conversations that I've had with folks. Because if you are paying for a high-end experience, you're going to get a high-end experience most of the time with people who can hold the space for you in those environments. And I think holding the space is so important and not something that is talked about nearly enough. I had to talk to a therapist about how to channel therapist skills in just simple sales conversations, because the amount of information, I know it's the same way in your world, the amount of emotion that bleeds onto me from somebody else who is raw and still in pain as they're writing their memoir or they're about to publish it. It is overwhelming some days. I hear the most intense stories that I am crying. It's just, and they're crying like in the middle of a conversation just to see if we're okay to work together. Right. And so, but I'm capable of holding that space. And I know there's a lot of people who are not capable of it. And I'm not saying that makes me better or worse. It just is a difference here to know, and to pay attention to those clues, because I can't imagine pouring your heart and soul and then someone would be like, well, who's your target audience? Like, that just seems so like tone deaf, and it's just not, and then look for the next partner who actually is like, oh my God, like, I can relate to what you're saying. I can empathize with what you're saying. Here's what I would do. And it still might mean that you're not the right partner, but you have a better sense of who might be the next partner to send them to next.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, so like, you need to know if that's what you're looking for. If you don't care about somebody being emotional with you, then maybe it's not going to be a big deal, right? But like, if you're coming to the relationship really wanting them to care as much as you do and like respond emotionally to what you're saying and be on that level together, then you need to pay attention to that. If that doesn't matter as much to you, then maybe the like get it done kind of business only perspective, right? Provider who's just like, here, I'm going to check all the boxes and we're just going to make this like business all the time. That might work for your style too. We're not suggesting that you go with somebody who's emotional necessarily. And I don't use emotional as in like, weepy and over the top and exaggerative. But I also want to put this in here too. We've talked about memoir, but the emotional piece is still important, even in your prescriptive nonfiction, really in any writing, because it's the author that's coming with the emotions, not necessarily the story. Like the author who's writing the book with 25 years of their expertise, right? Who's wanting to make this a legacy piece, wanting to change their industry with what they're having to say, they're coming with just as much vulnerability, to some extent, like worrying about being an imposter, worrying that they've not thought of something, that they're putting a stake in the ground permanently, but what if their opinion changes later? There's just as many things coming that could be, raising the stakes for that author, where they could still be in an emotional place and need the emotional provider to meet them, even if it's not a trauma thing or trauma work.
Absolutely. Yeah, our egos are all wrapped into all of this, and everyone's ego is in varying degrees of needing to be held or supported, and at the very least respected.
We could go on and on and on. I almost feel like we need to do a part 2 of this conversation.
I think we probably should. Maybe we can see if anyone has any like, yes, please do a part 2 in the comments.
Yeah, we would love to hear that, because we don't have a topic picked yet for next month, even though we are returning. So if you'd like to hear more on this, please let us know. In the meantime, Jen, flash that sexy book of yours into the camera. I know that Jen and I each cover working with providers and questions to ask and things that make a good partnership in each of our books. They're basically fraternal twins.
They really are. They're just like the yin and yang to one another. They're beautiful.
Yeah. We've got great stuff. So you can't go wrong with either of these desk references sitting right next to you on this journey and being referred to as you're trying to find the right providers for you, no matter what stage of the journey you are in creating your book, and no matter what kind of book it is that you are writing. Find the people who are going to collaborate and be your partner and be your person from start to finish. You won't be sorry, and it'll be worth every penny that you spend to have found the right person. Anything else from you, Jen, before we wrap up?
No, I feel like amen to all of that. You just were very succinct and on fire today. So no comment.
It's because of fumes in the coffee, We will spare you all the details of what that even means. And we will see you all next month for another Unscripted with Ally and Jen.
Thank you, Ally. See you soon.
Yeah.
Bye.